Democracy is in the news a lot these days. It usually sounds something like this.
What once seemed like the end of history, the triumph of democracy, now feels like something else.
It's because democracy itself has become a source of anxiety, that there is so much fear that it's almost palpable in the atmosphere, that somehow democracy is not performing up to specs.
Speaking today near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a pivotal site in America's Revolutionary War, President Biden framed the stakes of the 2024 election.
Whether democracy is still America's sacred cause is the most urgent question of our time. And it's what the 2024 election is all about.
But those headlines leave out the people and organizations who work tirelessly day in and day out to create a healthier democracy. It's time to change the narrative. Welcome to Democracy is Good News, a new series from the Democracy Group podcast network. This month, we're exploring how the business community is stepping up to support democracy. You might be wondering, what does business have to do with democracy in the first place? As it turns out, the two are closely related when it comes to consumer trust and corporate sustainability. Let's start with the consumer perspective, which comes down to one word: trust. At a time when trust in government and the media are decreasing, business is seen as one of the few institutions people can trust. Some business leaders see that trust as a responsibility to speak and act in ways that support democracy. If you don't believe me, listen to Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, speaking at the 2023 Forum on Business and Democracy, sponsored by the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
And I have no problem saying that I think it is not just right, but proper for businesses not only to speak up, but to stand up for the defense of democracy.
The relationship between business and democracy goes still a layer deeper than that. If a government isn't stable, then capitalism isn't either. For more on this relationship, I talked with Patrick McGinnis, an entrepreneur and democracy advocate. Patrick has advised startups around the world, sometimes in places where democracy is not as stable as it is in the US. He's also an author, a speaker, and a podcaster. He recently spoke to me from his home studio in New York City.
Yeah, so the business to flourish, business requires a couple of basic things: rule of law and order, also predictability, the ability to understand where the government is going to act in the future and how it's going to set the rules in a way that is, not only strategic, but also that should be treating people fairly. And so I've worked in a number of countries where those things are either diminished or don't exist. And it makes it a lot harder for people to invest, to build, to be entrepreneurs. And having spent much of my career working in emerging markets as an investor in places like Argentina and Turkey, where democracy has been so challenged, I started to see some of the things that I was worried about in those countries popping up in America. And I thought it's time to do something before it's too late.
Patrick grew up in Maine, a state that leads the way on voter turnout, electing independent-minded candidates to office, and democracy reforms like ranked choice voting. He wanted to bring those elements to national politics and found a way to do that through Leadership Now, an organization that pairs business leaders with civic organizations for mentorship and support. Given his upbringing and his line of work, I asked Patrick if he saw a parallel between pushing for change in the business world and pushing for change in the political world.
I invest in early stage ventures. I work with entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur myself. Therefore, when I see an entrenched system that doesn't work, my first thought is like, how do we disrupt this? And I also think because I grew up in the state of Maine where we enacted ranked choice voting so early, and where Maine has always been a very special place for politics, where there is a different conversation, where there is much more diversity of voices, and the conversation is pretty cordial. I just thought to myself, like, well, we did it in Maine. Why can't we do it in other places? And so it's always been something that I felt was very possible. Now I realize now that I'm in this, how challenging it is. But I do think that idea of disruption and the belief in it made it easier for me to engage in politics.
Over the past few years, Patrick has devoted episodes of his podcast, FOMO Sapiens, to democracy reform. But his biggest contribution has been working with BridgeUSA, a youth-led organization focused on fighting political division. Here's a little more about the organization in the words of its members.
We represent generations of change makers working toward the greatness of this nation that lies beneath the smokescreen of our most tumultuous conflicts and ugly scars. We are the new change makers, and it's our responsibility to finish the job of our predecessors.
Bridging the gap between two major divides in this country. And who better to tackle that than the next generation of...
Patrick has helped BridgeUSA in many ways, from small things like bringing in a colleague to redo the organization's website to larger initiatives like fundraising.
Every organization in the bridging space is looking to grow its base of donors, right? Because what I find so astounding is the fact that you have, like when I watched the news up in Maine during election season, the amount of ads that are run during Jeopardy, Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins. And I'm like, this is costing millions of dollars. If we took like 2% of this and gave it to bridging, our country would be in a much better space. So that's just, it's a new space. It's looking to raise capital. And so a lot of what, I've tried to help the team with, and, it's really a big part of our board work is trying to think through how do we craft a message that resonates with our donors? How do we get to those people? How do we tell our story in public, right? I do a lot of media work. I have a podcast. So I'm very comfortable with the idea of like, how do we frame up a story and then reach people in a way that really hits them where it matters so that people know who we are, what we do, and are excited to support our mission.
Patrick has also spent a lot of time thinking about a group of people known as conflict entrepreneurs who seek to make profit from political divisions and democratic instability. As an entrepreneur himself, Patrick had a few ideas about how to push back against these forces that seek to destabilize democracy for their own benefit.
The first is to expose the lie, expose the fact that this person is, their incentives are, impure. And I think that does happen it usually just takes a long time, but a lot of these people are deeply corrupt and they're, actually horrible to the people who work with them. And then they get exposed and canceled and whatever. But like that's one way to do it. The other way to do it, which is really hard, but I think the better way is to build a better product. And it's hard because the conflict entrepreneur gives us that dopamine hit. It gives us all it's a very addictive kind of thing, but it's also exhausting and people get tired. And so if you can deliver people a product that makes them feel better and it alleviates the stress, it's sort of like this podcast. It's a good news podcast. You're not, we're not sitting here trying to get people like, up in their throats for their dopamine hits. If you can do that, then you will build something that's far more sustainable and has a better impact. But it takes really disruptive thinking.
Of course, something like that takes time to build. But that's the commitment that Patrick and the team at BridgeUSA are dedicated to. And taking that long view is something he encourages his colleagues in the business world to do as well. Often, entrepreneurs are looking for the next big company to invest in or the next boom to follow. That might work for business, but democracy requires slow, sustained work to ensure long-term success.
The frame that people typically think about when they think about politics is either I knock on doors or I write a check. And it's like, those are the only two things. And I certainly thought that too. And what I've learned, of course, in my engagement with Leadership Now is that, yeah, you can do those things. And they're helpful as well. Like, certainly wonderful to do that. But it's the ideas of smart people who are committed and passionate and their time to implement those ideas. Like that's much more valuable. That sets you apart. Like anybody can write a check, right? Any billionaire can write $100 million check. But can a billionaire come up with the next big idea and then work with a group of like-minded people to implement it? Maybe, probably not. They have their own objectives, right? And so it is that idea that we can harness the power of business people. Business people are good at solving problems, right? That's what they do. Take that mindset and bring it into the political sphere and match it with all these other people who really understand politics. Bring that together. Like, wow, you can do big things.
To learn more about Patrick, check out his podcast, FOMO Sapiens. To learn more about Leadership Now, the organization Patrick volunteers for, visit leadershipnowproject.org. We'll be back soon with more stories of democracy's good news. Until then, I'm Jenna Spinelle. Thanks for tuning in.